Ya'at eshik Diné. Greetings, my kin and my people. This is Lyla June, host of Nihizhi, Indigenous Solutions, Indigenous Voices podcast.
Hi, this is Katina Stone Butler with the Black History for White People podcast.
So happy to be with each other today. We're so excited to do this very special episode where we are discussing how to be in deeper solidarity between the Black community and the Indigenous community, how to show up for each other, how we've showed up for each other in the past, and really have some of the harder conversations that we don't always talk about within our communities, with the aim of being more resonant with each other and more healed with each other and more strong as we move forward for our collective liberation. Yes. Katina, maybe you could just give a brief overview of the impacts of colonization on the Black community. I know that's a very big subject, but maybe just, go off on what you want to share with listeners who are of many different audiences on these podcasts.
Well, just first of all, thank you, for spending this time with me. I think that it is so powerful and necessary for us as Black and Indigenous people to give language to our shared experiences and our triumph, and even, and how we stood in solidarity throughout history on this land that was stolen, from Indigenous people, and land that was forced upon Black bodies. And so as a Black woman with Indigenous roots, my great-grandmother, who passed away a couple of months before I got married in the mid-90s, she was Black and Indigenous. Her mother was a Cherokee woman. And just growing up, sitting at her feet and learning from her experience as a Black woman and an Indigenous woman. And just my parents, who instilled in me very early on, wanting me to have knowledge and understand who I am, who I was, and where I came from. There's so much intersectionality and just intertwining of Black and Indigenous history. But Black womanhood was a construct that was created by colonization. Before enslavement in Europe and here on this land, I was not a Black woman. I was whatever tribe, from whatever people, from wherever, I lived, my people lived. But Black womanhood began on a slave ship, and specifically for America, began in 1619. Black womanhood was created for commodification. It was created for breeding and for basically being the incubators for a system of enslavement and oppression that would last for hundreds of years, but then the residual effects and the impact would still be felt today. It shows up in the many disparities in our health and intergenerational trauma. The Black experience in this country, and it's not limited to that experience, but Black people, of course, came in mass. There were Black people here and all types of people here on this land prior to enslavement, but Black people came in mass on ships for the purpose of enslavement. The system of whiteness still benefits from farming tobacco fields and picking cotton. My parents picked cotton as little kids. My great-grandmother, who didn't pass away until I was 20, she was born in 1899, and her father was enslaved. And so there was a time when there were 5 generations on both sides of the family that were alive. And so I was able to hear many stories of enslavement, of Jim Crow. I was born just very shortly after Jim Crow. I was a part of the generation that integrated schools. My parents, they were the first generation to integrate schools. They were the late boomers. My parents, both growing up in poverty in rural Tennessee, all the stories that land on us, like their individual stories and individual experiences that flow from a river and an ocean of a system of oppression. Our stories are lived out, born from, this system. And I don't know if that gives you, I mean, there's no way I can really give you a history, but I can share my experience. I mean, I can give you the history and how it lands on our experience, other than, us going to the books and saying this is what happened.
Honestly, your words are extremely powerful and potent for me. And just the words, Black womanhood was born on a slave ship, like that really brought me to tears. I think something similar could be said for some of the indigenous communities that we see today. The amount of, a lot of people look at the reservation and like, oh, why are these Indians so poor? Why are they so fat? Why do we have so much diabetes?
Oh my
gosh. Why, and they say terrible. I've literally heard
Horrible.
people say that. And it's like, our current situation has nothing to do with us. And it is a pure reflection of the cruelty of colonization. Like, don't put that on us. That's not us. Right. That's not even us. That's what the actions of colonization have created. And even with those actions, we are still bouncing back, standing up, being amazing rock stars, with love in our hearts and prayers on our lips for everyone, I love to see it. But yeah, so thank you for sharing that, and the amount of connection you have to these things that people say, oh, that's in the past, but like you are within that lineage and you met the woman whose father endured enslavement is very powerful. And just to touch a little bit on that Afro-Indigeneity, I lived in Alabama for quite a while, and every Black person I met there, I shouldn't say every, but the vast majority were also Indigenous. They might have phenotypically, visually looked Black, and they were Black. I love what Melanin Muskogee does or says. She says, indigeneity and Blackness are not mutually exclusive. They are absolutely coexisting. And any Afro-Indigenous person, we should support them in the reclamation of both identities simultaneously. But anyways, what I always heard is, the way colonization affected Indigenous peoples is about 98% were wiped out. This is due to massacre and disease. With Black bodies, they wanted to preserve them, right? Because for their own capitalistic, disgusting purposes, right? But with Indigenous bodies, they wanted to annihilate them. So there's a really important endeavor within the colonial system to destroy Indigenous peoples because they inhabited the lands that were coveted. And I'm honestly not really sure why they didn't want to enslave us too. I know they tried, but that's an interesting question. I don't have education or time to go into now, but I do know that they really enjoyed annihilating us. And it was very supportive of their claim of land. So anyways, because of that, you have 2% of the Indigenous population left. A lot of the tribes we know today, such as Seminole, Navajo, these are actually survival bands. They do not represent the original composition of the people. Like 98% is a big amount. And so 2 things on that. Number one, when you only have 2% left, there's a genetic bottleneck oftentimes, and you have to marry outside of your race or outside of your family because you're related to almost everyone. And that's a joke we say in Native communities is like, I know one day I'll find someone I'm not related to. So we married into Black families, and Black families supported us in continuing our lineages onward. And I'm so excited for this Afro-Indigeneity movement, which is bringing that power of the Indigenous root that is within those lineages out and combining those powers. But also on that note, when there's so few of this left, we also had to think about today there are 573 Indigenous nations in the United States alone, 573 distinct tribes. And that's after 98% were killed off. So times that to extrapolate it back to 100%, you have thousands and thousands of different Native communities. And so the original composition of that grandeur, of that grandiosity, of that beauty of those civilizations is often lost on the historical record.
Yeah.
So anyways, that's obviously a big way that colonization impacted our communities, was just pure erasure of our bodies, erasure of our languages, erasure of our cultures. And that's why people like me, the survivors of the 2%, right? Like, we're so beautifully bringing all of
Yes.
that back. We're saying we want land back, we want our culture back, we want our language back, we want our bodies back. You know, we want to live. We want to live on this land. We want to exist. That's oftentimes the baseline desire. So anyways, I could go on and on too about the effects of colonization on Indigenous peoples, but suffice it to say, it was commonplace before the late 1800s to just shoot every single Native person you saw on site.
And I live in Denton, Texas, where there was a monument, a Confederate monument, but also that was just taken down during the protest of 2020. But also the founder of this land, John B. Denton, there is a tribute to him, and it talks about how he, proudly annihilated all of the Indigenous people from this land in the name of whiteness. I mean, this is something that I personally have read, and I've lived here for 28 years, and it's proudly displayed. So absolutely. And there's a history of the annihilation of Indigenous people in Dallas. And this is why they are doing so much work to eradicate and revise history, because their arrogance, the arrogance and the pride of whiteness, they documented everything. So we can see it clearly. Like it's been there in our faces this whole time in the monuments. I call them concrete penises, in the monuments that they erected. They're foul, like they're foul, like their penises. I mean, that's what they are. And that they erected after enslavement, 50 years after enslavement is over, because of that pride and that arrogance and that, the songs, the music, an entire culture built on the construct of destroying and annihilating people and commodifying people. So, yeah, I affirm everything that you say. And I am just a few miles from Oklahoma. And just even when I have driven into Oklahoma, because I've gone, I've been there quite a bit, the spirit of heaviness that I feel, because I feel like the spiritual ramifications of oppression and just everything that systemic oppression has done to our people, I feel it. You do not spill that much blood and it doesn't cry from the ground. I mean, we are walking on blood every day. We are walking on grass that has been watered with blood.
We have, and I believe that there's an opportunity to heal in this very dark situation. Yeah. And I also often acknowledge that what we now today call white folks were once indigenous to a land, and that they learned all of these things, all of the conquest, all of the scarcity mindset, all of the domination mindset from their own oppressors, talking about the Roman expansion, talking about how the women of Europe were burned as witches, talking about the prohibition of indigenous European languages. You couldn't speak Welsh, Gaelic, or Celtic in school up until the early 1900s. It was banned. And the enslavement as well that the Romans would do to others, all of that, they call it the Dark Ages for a reason, right? 2,000 years of open warfare in Europe. So one of my Native elders says, you have to have compassion and understanding for the colonizers, because they were coming from all out war, the bubonic plague wiping out a third of everyone overnight. White folks, as we say now, and I actually am part European, so I even identify as a white person sometimes. I have that lineage and that, to some degree, that privilege, although I don't look very white, that we carry a lot of trauma as white folks. We are like oozing with it, and we ooze it all over everyone else, you know? And so I think the healing that is capable on this land, on what we call Turtle Island, you know, we try not to call it America because that's from Amerigo Vespucci, is documented to have been on commission to look for people to enslave and gold to extract. That was his sole purpose of his quote unquote voyages. So we don't like to call it America. We don't like to be called Native Americans. We don't want to be named after that guy. We prefer indigenous people. We prefer to call this land Turtle Island. So now that I got that out of the way, I think there's a lot of opportunity for healing on this land we call Turtle Island, because so much blood, as you said, has watered this grass. It's sort of like the darkest times can yield the most beautiful acts of bravery, of courage, of remorse and forgiveness and apology and reparation. The darker it is, the more beautiful it is when we stand up and be good to each other and heal these things. So I'm really grateful that this episode is part of that, one small part of that. But going on to, we have a little idea of what we want to say today. One of the things we were talking about is sharing the beauty of the cross-pollination of Black and Indigenous communities, highlighting some of the ways in which our respective communities have shown up for each other. So I don't know if there's any specific examples you want to share, or just what you want to say in your heart about, the history of examples of how we have been there for each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the intermarrying of Black and Indigenous people, I think, is a huge part of our history of solidarity. And also, as a measure of protection and covering how African Americans, Black people, would flee to indigenous territories for protection, hide when we were fleeing enslavement. There would be shelter and there would be care and solidarity there, in escaping to freedom. There are many stories, like I said, as well as intermarrying. And even the fact that Indigenous people are not a monolith, just like Black people are not a monolith. And partly because of enslavement in this country, like a Black person can look white, because of how Black women were raped and bred like animals. But also Indigenous people can look just like me. They could be darker than me. They could have complete like jet Black skin and not have intermarried, right? So an Indigenous person could be Black skinned or brown skinned, and if they step outside of their space, they'll be treated just like a Black person, just like a person who is an immigrant from Nigeria can come over here and not have necessarily had the experience that Black Americans have. But if they get pulled over by the cops, they're going to be seen as a Black person, because that's how whiteness is. The construct of whiteness has to categorize everyone. And if you're Black or white, you could still say that you are Hispanic or non-Hispanic. Like, they have to put us in categories. And so for many people that are Indigenous, they are living the Black experience because of the skin that they are housed in, right? But as far as solidarity, when you think about that being the backdrop, there's all kinds of ways that we had to show up for each other because we were treated with equal disdain for different reasons. Like you said, the annihilation of Indigenous people and the commodification of Black bodies. But I think about Stokely Carmichael, when he stood in solidarity, I think it was in 1973, with Indigenous group who stormed Wounded Knee, and how he had a philosophy about how we as a people, Black and Indigenous people, we could only overcome and really fight this war by the taking back of land. And how land was just, and this is where it started, with them taking your land. with them annihilating indigenous people for land, and us trying to stake our claim by taking land back was where it was at, and Stokely Carmichael was just, he's one person and there's many. I just think about him in the 60s and 70s, giving space and holding space for indigenous brothers and sisters. That's absolutely like one of my heroes. But then, just like I said, the natural ways we coexisted under the white gaze, and we have different experiences, but they're so meshed together, which is so sad when you think about how there's so much effort to divide marginalized people groups, and for us to hate each other and to play the game of who was oppressed more. And I would venture to say that no one, not in this country, no one has been persecuted more than indigenous and Black people. And we are so much stronger together because of, our experience, and we've been together.
Yes. And I remember one time when I was at Oregon State University giving a talk or something, there was the most beautiful indigenous longhouse on the campus. And it brought me to tears to learn that the Black Student Union was a very strong ally and accomplice and partner to the indigenous student group in the creation of this longhouse on campus. Like, it makes me cry right now, like that the Black Student Union would see an indigenous struggle and like stand behind them and be right there with them side by side the whole way until they got this longhouse. There's something like extremely beautiful about that. Vice versa, I know that Nick Tilson, who is the head of the Indie In Collective, which is a pretty massive indigenous organization, national indigenous organization, spent a lot of time with Alicia Garza and the Black Lives Matter movement, putting the power, what power we have as indigenous peoples, which isn't always a lot, but whatever we got, behind the Black Lives Matter movement. And I see like indigenous folks really showing up for the movements that are on the ground in the streets. And at the very same time, you and I are going to get into some ways we haven't shown up for each other. We don't want to sugarcoat it or make it puppies and rainbows, because there's been times when we have not been there for each other. And there is still anti-Blackness within the indigenous community still today. So even though I'm brought to tears, and I never, like, those tears will never be discounted at the ways in which we've been there for each other. And we've stepped outside of ourselves, outside of our struggles, outside of our movements, outside of our pain, and stepped into the other community's struggle, movement, pain, and shown up, stood by them. I think that absolutely has happened throughout time, like you said. And I love the other links you sent me earlier today. There's a very iconic picture of all these statues coming down during the protests of 2020. And there's, of course, like a lot of statues of Columbus that are hitting the dirt. And I couldn't help but be like, wow, this watershed moment for Black folks by Black folks is also including a watershed moment for indigenous peoples. And granted, there's a whole lot of more work to do on both sides. But I even, I've been trying to find a husband for, everyone knows, like many years. And I even was briefly getting to know someone who said, I don't like that they changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. I said, why? He said, well, because I'm Italian and I'm proud of Columbus. I'm like, wait, so just because he's the same, but he's documented to have been very brutal, raped people, talked down to people, murdered people, and destroyed whole cultures which he thought were worthless.
Wow.
And he said, well, I don't care, because it's because of the indigenous blood that was spilled that America was able to exist. And so I thank you and your people for sacrificing yourselves for the creation of this nation. Yeah, no. And obviously that was the first and last date I ever went on with this person. Yeah. But dating as a Native woman, like, it's like I have to re-educate. If I'm not dating a Native man, I have to educate usually a person like from the ground up, and like I have to explain we're not like primitive cavemen. We're not still living in teepees, and like it's just like insane. So to see that Columbus statue go down was really exciting for me. But I also know the ignorance that still exists in the white community that is so upset that this statue would go down, and they feel attacked and defensive and all that BS. God bless them. But, they feel like the victim now, which is insane to me. Yeah. I love that.
They want to be persecuted so bad. And the people who have actually been persecuted can't get any, it's insane. Yeah.
I love that scene in the Harriet Tubman film that came out where the white woman was quote unquote losing her property, and because the enslaved peoples were like moving out, and she starts crying, she's like, what about me? Think of everything I'm losing. And it's like, yeah, you are losing your handle on people's necks. Deal with it. Right. Like, I'm so sorry for you. You must feel terrible, but like, thank God you're losing this, and that's a real thing. That is a very real thing that we are experiencing in America, where there's this white fear of losing power. And like you said, it's expressing itself as I'm being persecuted, right? But anyways, what I was trying to say is that there are also some issues within the Indigenous and Black communities that we've already agreed we need to voice these. And I want to just do it real quick on my side is that, Katina and I have talked about all this beautiful solidarity. We've talked about all of our visions. And even Katina and I had to have some conversations to learn from each other, to figure stuff out. And we're still in that process. There is also a very negative side. So, for example, there are Native nations who did enslave Black folks. This is a documented historical fact. For example, I know that Tsalagi, aka Cherokee, were one of them, I believe. I know there was others. I'm sorry, I'm not educated enough to say exactly who. But not only did they enslave Black folks, but once emancipation legally occurred, according to white laws, not only did these Native nations enslave these folks, but they also would not give them citizenship within the tribal roles after they were freed. So this is the freedmen issue, which we would be remiss to not mention in this episode. The freedmen are essentially Black folks who were freed from Cherokee enslavement and never were allowed to be a part of the tribe. And this is after they had given so much to the tribe. They had given their labor, their sweat, their even intermarriage. A lot of these folks were even blood related, and they still weren't allowed in the tribe due to anti-Blackness. So we have to give citizenship and enrollment to the freedmen who are still asking for this today. That is my stern stance as an Indigenous woman, to speak to my own Indigenous people and say, come on, like, we can do better. We are all about relationships, relationality, kinship. Why are we excluding these folks from our communities who were such a deep, integral part of our communities? Okay, so there's that. The second thing I want to say is that there is still anti-Blackness within our Indigenous communities, which we inherited from white supremacist culture. Like, we're just copying our own oppressor to feel like we have a little more power. And that needs to stop. For example, in the Diné culture, the word for Black, the color, is Hlejin. And from Hlejin, there was a word that was created for Black folks that has a very othering, derogatory term. And I've even heard my own family use it in my lifetime. We need to stop that. We need to go back to our original way of seeing, which is kinship. We gave everybody a clan, and there are Afro-Indigenous Diné people who have done a lot of work to abolish this term, which comes from the word Hlejin, and to replace it with a new Diné word, which means those who have overcome. That is our new clan name for Black folks. And so when Afro-Indigenous children introduce their clans within a native Diné setting, they can say, I'm Tachitni clan on my mom's side, and I'm those who overcame on my father's side, you know? So giving dignity. But anti-Blackness shows up, it's insidious, it's silent sometimes, it's subtle, and it's extremely toxic and damaging. So what can we do as Indigenous peoples to acknowledge the anti-Blackness that we have mimicked and inherited from white folks and the white supremacist system, and replace it with kinship, replace it with bringing folks in and saying, you are our kin just as much as any other living creature on this earth. You know, we say we're relatives to the trees. We say we're relatives to the clouds. We say we're relatives to the buffalo. Why aren't we relatives to our Black relatives? And that's what we need to come back to. So, okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox there for a second, but I had to say that.
And on the Black hand side, which is, you know, that's a Black saying. I don't know if you ever heard 25 on the Black hand side. That's something that came out of the 60s and 70s. But on the Black hand side, the ways in which we practice anti-Indigenous, it's hard to explain, but I'll give it a shot. It's how colonization has done a number on all of us. It has stripped identity and how we are not able to trace our lineage. You know, for African Americans, it can be almost impossible to trace who you are back to a certain generation. And because of intergenerational trauma and just the desire to want to get past and move past this horrible history, and because of how even today, white America has become so consumptive of the Black experience through the lens of enslavement. You know, you have these so-called woke white people who want to tell our stories and think that they can tell them better than us. And a lot of the stories that through the lens in which they tell it is us being whipped and beaten, which is a part of our history. But in wanting to distance ourselves from enslavement and instead of embracing it, it's so funny how Black people are like, I don't want to see any more slave movies. And for me personally, because my great-great-grandmother, who I spent summers with, who helped raise me, and I spent time on her land, you know, she was so proud to tell me that her father was enslaved. And I wrestled with that. And I have so much pride in my enslaved ancestors because they were still overcoming, and I still stand on their shoulders, right? I stand on their shoulders, and they are not, and that's why I don't use the word slaves. I use the word enslaved, because they were not what they were made to be. They were still, you know, doctors and lawyers and inventors and craftsmen and women and seamstresses and healers and midwives. They were human. But because colonization has did such a number in stripping our identity, Black people want to disassociate ourselves. Some Black people want to disassociate ourselves from that experience. And we latch on to identities that are convoluted, contaminated with a revisionist history, in the same ways that white people or white folks or the system of whiteness has revised history to its advantage. And while I do understand, I don't agree. And so, for example, in the ways that Black people will say, well, we were already here. We were not brought over. We were not in Africa. We were already here. Well, yes. Do I believe that Black people were here? People with Black skin were here on this land? Absolutely. Because again, one, people from Africa, people from all over the world had been on this land, just like Columbus came to this land. This land was not discovered. It was already lived on. And there were exchanges, you know, between communities and Black people who existed here. But there were Indigenous people and Black Indigenous people, you know, there was all of that here. But in mass,
Mm-hmm.
Black people came from parts of Africa via enslavement. And we don't have to,
Mm-hmm. And there's no shame
right.
in that because that wasn't
There's no
y'all.
shame.
Like, yeah.
I had a friend. I went through a specific inexperience some years ago, and I remember feeling so much shame. And it wasn't something that I did to myself; it was something that was done to me. And I was telling my friend, "I'm so embarrassed," and she was like, "What? What the hell are you embarrassed for? You ain't do it. You didn't do it to yourself. It was done to you." You should not be embarrassed for anything.
Mm-hmm.
You should be walking around with your head held high with pride because you didn't do it. And so that's the way I feel. I
Mm-mm.
am proud of I'm proud of, and it's so interesting because like the movie Black Panther, which I love, especially I love the first one. And I really struggled with the character Killmonger because he would destroy Black people because he was hurting, because he was hurt for one. There was T'Challa who was more of a we are the world type. And then there was Killmonger. And they
Mm-hmm.
tried to make it like a Martin Luther King versus Malcolm thing. And I don't know how I feel about all that, because I feel like we try so hard to just make something fit and stuff. Things have nuance and they have complexities, and you can't just fit stuff
Mm-hmm.
in a box like that. And you can't
Mm-hmm.
pack it into a movie, even though I love Black Panther, the movie, and I love so much of what they did. I walked away, feeling a little conflicted on some other things. But at the end, when he says, bury, throw me in the ocean with my ancestors who believed that, basically they were too dignified to be enslaved. That's not fair. That's not a fair statement because sometimes Black people will make these distinctions and say, well, I would have never, you don't know what the hell you would have ever did. You would have been enslaved. And just because people were enslaved and their names are not the names that we celebrate because they're unknown, there are people who stayed on the plantation because they didn't want their child to die. There are people who didn't run away because they wanted to love on the community that was there. There were people who were pissing and pooping in the master's food and poisoning the masters a little bit at a time. There, there were people that were
Mm-hmm.
working those cotton fields and just trying to make it from day to day. They get the same dignity as the ones who fought on the ships, the ones who jumped off the ships. They get the same dignity. And so what happens is, and I'm sorry for the long explanation, but what happens is like, we should not be stripping other people, especially other marginalized groups, of their dignity in order to uplift the dignity for ourselves or in order to stake a claim for ourselves. Let the truth be the truth. And there is good truth and ugly truth. Just like, I'm Black and with Indigenous ancestry and Cherokee, Tennessee Cherokee. And there is that ugly history that Cherokee people enslaved Black people. It doesn't make me less or more. It just is what it is. And then my thing is, give grace to people who were enslaved, who were doing the best that they could do, because people will say stuff like, oh, I'm not my ancestors. You sure in the hell aren't. You aren't your ancestors. And that you should not say that as a slight. I'm not my ancestors. I'll do this and that. The only reason why you can fight the way you can fight is because of your ancestors. For the ones who could not fight, you're able to fight for them and then some. So we should not make these white colonized distinctions between our experiences and our ancestors. And we should not try to stake a claim on an experience that is not ours. We should shed tears for the Black brothers and sisters whose bloodline was annihilated, whose people were commodified, whose people were enslaved. We have enough tears to shed for all of them, and we have enough dignity to pour out on everyone because they should not be less. We shouldn't distance ourselves from our identity because someone else decided the fate of someone who looks like us. So
Wow, thank you so much. That is incredibly powerful, incredibly nuanced, and incredibly firm in how in where you stand. And I want to give people a little background in case they don't know sort of like the deeper thing of what you're alluding to is that there's a huge movement within the Black community to say all kinds of interesting things, like Black folks were here before enslavement, also, which is
Right.
true, like everyone and their mom was here before
Right.
Columbus. I just want to say that. Like the Chinese
Right.
were here, the
Absolutely.
Africans were here, the Tahitians were here. The way my elder said, Creator made the oceans to have roads. And to imply that African people were not capable of seafaring before Columbus is also racist. I truly deeply believe that the Afro-Brazilian culture that is so strong was there way before enslavement in Brazil. That's just my personal belief. Obviously, I'd have to do all kinds
Right.
of work to prove that, but like there is documented periods where African folks set
Right.
sail, and this was and even the Norse came. We know before Columbus, like 400 years. So, anyways, so I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that people have gone so far to say that African people civilized Native Americans first. There's literally a article that came out, and there's all kinds of stuff on the internet, so you can't give it too much weight. But there's an
Yeah.
article that talks about
Yeah.
how before Columbus, Africans brought civilization to America, and like how insane is that sentence for so many reasons? Like, as if to say there wasn't already civilization here, and to call this land America is to
Right.
glorify and reify the same guy who was enslaving both of us. That's the background of what Katina is
Right.
saying. Is there is this toxic narrative, which, as you said, is to create distance from Blackness and enslavement between the two. And what you're saying is, hey, why do we have to be ashamed of
Right.
enslavement?
Right.
Isn't it incredible that that happened to us and we're still here? Like, and that's the same thing with me as a woman who's experienced a lot of gender violence. For a long time, I blamed myself. Oh, if I wouldn't have got drunk that
Right.
night, this guy wouldn't have done that to me. Or if I would have said no, he wouldn't have done that to me. But
Same.
at a certain
Yeah.
point, my mentor said, Lyla, why are you carrying the shame of what these men did to you? Like, that has nothing to do with you. You cool. You are
Exactly.
unscathed. You are unchanged. That is their stuff to carry. That is not yours to carry. So similarly, as with all different forms of abuse, there's parallels. And then a couple of things I wanted to share too.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And I think I'm just going to be brutally honest here. I think a lot of Indigenous peoples feel hurt that there is this huge attention, and I'd love your perspective on this, but this huge attention on
Yeah.
the Black Lives Matter movement, which is so important and so overdue. And I love that it is happening. Let me be clear. And at the very same time, I think Indigenous peoples
Right.
feel defeated, discouraged that we are not also having this watershed moment. Because what's fascinating is that Indigenous folks are, not to play oppression Olympics or any of that BS, but statistically, we are more likely
Right.
to be shot by the police than any other demographic in the country. And the police brutality on Native reservations is off the hook. I mean, and it's not it, and
Right.
I am glad that the spotlight is on police brutality against Black bodies. Like that needs to happen. I think I'm just being brutally honest that Indigenous peoples feel unheard, unseen, that is also happening, and other insane forms of violence like Indigenous women. The third leading cause of death is homicide for us. The third leading cause of death for Native women
Right.
is homicide. That is crazy. And it has everything to do with the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, the abduction and murder of Indigenous women's bodies, And it's not our own, Native men are not the people killing Native women. These are non-Native people coming onto our reservations, which have no legal ramifications for abduction and
Right.
murder, and
None.
killing women, like leaving them, like raping them, beating them, leaving them for dead. And I've heard terrible stories. I mean, weird stories, and like lynchings, sexual lynchings of Native women, you might say. And Gabby Petito, this white woman who was lost, getting huge national attention. Meanwhile, like we have this huge epidemic of Native women being abducted and going missing. So I'm just being brutally honest that like there is I almost want to say jealousy, although that's obviously terrible to have. Yeah. But there's a little bit of like, hey, when are we going to be seen as Indigenous peoples? I've even heard Native folks say, I'm a Native girl in a black and white world, which I know is completely oversimplified and it's not right at all. But I'm just saying that is the honest experience, whether it's right or wrong, that a lot of Native people have, is like there's so much incredible, brilliant, famous Black authors, musicians, filmmakers, leaders, and like we're so grateful for that. And I think there's a little tinge of like, we want that too, which I know is also problematic because you don't want to compete for white gaze, right? There's that whole thing. But I think what it is we want to be seen in our own homeland when oftentimes we just feel invisible.
So I'm going to say a few things because I definitely feel, your words and where you're coming from. This is the thing. Everything that you described, that lands at the feet of white people, because what's happening is that, or white society or the system, what happens is that whiteness has made Indigenous people invisible. When you look at the history of Black people in this country, the enslavement, then the so-called emancipation, and now just this re-emboldening by, Trump, they've made you guys invisible. But for us, we're like a stench in their nostrils. They benefit by criminalizing us. So Black Lives Matter is not in the media because everybody is supportive of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, Black resistance is in the media because they are using it to continue to make their points. It would be different if people are being celebrated. We're not being celebrated. We're still seeing images of Black bodies being slaughtered in the streets. And I get, and I'm gonna go there. I get go there where people and other people of color are saying, well, we're being made invisible by white and Blackness, but that was not created by Blackness. That was created by whiteness. And so Black people, we have had to become our own news coverage through social media, because the slaughter of Black people, by and large, was invisible for a very long time. And even us taking to the streets and doing the things that we have done, the media is still presenting this polarized view and using they're using our resistance to further criminalize and incriminate us. They're not using it to say, oh, well, they're right, people should have dignity. They're saying, oh, look at these, N-words in the street. This is why they deserve to be treated the way they're treated. Oh, they're lying. Oh, racism doesn't exist. So it's not furthering our cause with white folks. They're just using it all against us. But they have crippled Indigenous people in a way. I just feel like that is whiteness. It is set up to keep us pitted against each other. And to say, well, we struggle, just like when they throw the Irish in the pot. Oh, well, the Irish were enslaved and da-da-da-da-da. There is definitely a real conversation about why everything is made black and white. And there's no room for Indigenous people. Puerto Rico, there's no room. But that room not being made is not because of Black people. It's because of white people. And
Right,
so
right.
I would challenge my Indigenous sisters and brothers to take that fight where it belongs, at the feet of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I do believe that we have a responsibility towards each other, for each other, because you cannot uplift state sanctioned violence against Black bodies without holding space for its impact on Indigenous bodies. We need to hold space for each other, absolutely. And do I feel that there's power in that, for us to feel seen and heard by each other? Yes, we definitely need to do that. But we need to blame who's responsible for the invisibility. And that's not Black people, and that's not Indigenous people. That's the system of whiteness. And so there's that part. But then again, like I said, we need to hold space for each other. Yes, Indigenous women, they're being sexually abused, slaughtered, and trafficked in a way that's state sanctioned. There's no repercussions for an Indigenous woman being raped. It is insane. And yes, the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women is murder. That is disgusting, disheartening. We need to be yelling that off the rooftops. For Black women, 1 through 10 are rooted in healthcare disparities and medical racism, where Black women are not held, heard, or esteemed or regarded in the healthcare system. I have my own story, and I work in healthcare, and I'm a music artist, creative, but I fell into healthcare 20 something years ago. My mom's a retired nurse. I almost lost my mother to medical racism in a hospital that she worked decades in. Almost lost my oldest son because I wasn't being listened to. And I was told that I had a flu bug when actually what I had were tumors that were trying to force my baby out of my body, and I almost lost him. And so it's all killing us. At 1.75,000 missing Black girls and women. And the bottom line is, not to compare apples to apples, the bottom line is nobody cares about Indigenous women being raped in a country where that is supposed to be against the law. There's no law to protect an Indigenous woman, and nobody cares about Black women or Indigenous women going missing or being sex trafficked. This story about Carly Russell is being sensationalized as if that is the reason why Black women or women of color don't deserve to get news time or, our stories to be heard because this one Black girl lied. And even Black people buy into that. Yeah. And so we have to be careful, I think, not to buy into that kind of foolishness that would minimize our own voices. And we have to learn how to hold space for each other, because we're not suppressing our voices. And if we're uplifting our voices and we're getting the attention is always negative. It's never positive. Like, police brutality has not diminished. If anything, they've ridiculed and, tried to expose Black Lives Matter. It's a Jewish run syndicate. Like, they create conspiracy theories. Like, we're not better for being in the white news. We're not getting, Black girls are not being protected. Indigenous women are not being cared for more because they're in the white news. Dakota Pipeline, those stories, we're not better for them giving us a spotlight, because oftentimes they're using that spotlight against us. If that makes sense.
It does. There's a lot of points.
You push back and tell me what you think.
No, I love this. I love this vulnerability and honesty. No, I think you made a lot of really important points, and I think we need to have these discussions open and honest, or else we're never going to get anywhere. But I like the point you made of like, hey, don't be jealous of our spotlight because it's actually being used against us. And the other thing of like, hey, like this black and white conversation that is dominating the national conversation is not wrought by Black folks. It is wrought by whiteness. So bring it to that. So those points are well taken. One thing I wanted to add to that, all that is like, I think that sometimes that the miseducation of the whole country has caused Black folks to accidentally legitimize America within their struggle. So let me explain what I mean by that. Let's take Martin Luther King, for example. Yeah, one of the things he said was liberty and justice for all, And then when we tried to cash that check, it came back insufficient funds. And what he meant by that was he was saying, hey, look, America, you said this is a country built on liberty and justice for all. But when we as Black folks ask for our civil rights, you don't pay up. What I think he's accidentally doing in that process is he's legitimizing the American nation state. So let me explain what I mean by that, is that by asking for rights within an American legal system, you are subtly and implicitly legitimizing that America, that their laws and the whole country that creates them is legitimate. So what I mean by that is as Native people, we view the whole concept of America, the word America, the concept of America, as an illegitimate military occupation, an illegitimate, illegal military occupation of indigenous lands by their own laws. Even it's illegal, not discounting the universal laws of morality, it's illegal, but by their own laws. And so in the struggle for Black liberation, and like you said, it's not a monolith, so I'm not saying everyone ascribes to this, but I think with the desire to have a quote unquote place within America, not just Black folks, but all other immigrant, not to say Black folks are in the same category as immigrant communities, because they're not. It was by force that they were brought here, but other immigrant communities, such as the quote unquote Asian American community, the Indian American community, even that hyphenation of American, Indian American, Chinese American, like is reifying and legitimizing that America belongs here, which I know is extremely controversial statement to many pro-American listeners. But that what I'm saying is that as we fight for our rights, quote unquote, within an American system, we are reifying that system. When the alternative, what we could be doing instead is saying, look, what maybe Martin Luther King could have said is, y'all are operating on stolen indigenous lands. We have to say that first and foremost. Yes. And regardless of your laws, regardless of your of the civil rights you afford to different peoples or people in general, we all need to be treated humanely, period. And that does not depend on the existence of America as a nation state. So in other words, like, how do we delegitimize America while at the same time fighting for Black liberation? How do we not, for example, on CNN, they said Black voters, white voters, Hispanic voters, and then they said something else, right? Like Native voters weren't even in the little graph, which, to your point, that is not Black people's creation. That is the creation of a white news network, right? But in this graph, it says Black voters, white voters, and then Native people weren't even on the list. You know, like we were called something else. Right. And it caused this huge ripple in social media. And we made all kinds of, Native people were very funny. So we made fun of it. And, I guess I'm just something else or whatever. But it was terrible, right? And so I want to say, how do Black folks not buy into that framing that CNN and white culture is creating of forgetting? I think what I'm trying to say is, while I agree that Black folks are not generating that Black and white conversation, they still fall prey to it sometimes, right? They still, not intentionally, but accidentally forget that Native folks are here and that the entire struggle for Black liberation is occurring on stolen indigenous lands, and that indigenous rights are just as important as we fight for Black liberation, and vice versa. So I don't know if that makes sense either, but I hope that adds color to like.
It does.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love and hear and feel everything that you are saying. And that's jolting for me as a person who I feel that, I am doing the work of anti-racism. And I needed to hear that, maybe calling myself an African American, which I actually love the term Black, but maybe calling myself an African American isn't a good idea in order to stand in solidarity with my indigenous sisters and brothers. And so
What if you said African Turtle Islander? I know
Girl,
that takes a long time to say, but it could be like a way to be like, I don't subscribe to your American stuff. Like, no, this is Turtle
yes.
Island, you know?
And I love that. And the thing is just this conversation has given me a burden and an awareness that I need to carry with me. This is the beauty of where we are in our generation right now. On the shoulders that we stand on the shoulders of the afflicted, the oppressed. And we are the bloodline, like we are the lineage and we are the hope, you know. And in our generation, we are the ones who are putting language, very strong, you know, current language, when our elders, all they could do was put their head down and work. You know, different generations have contributed different things. When I look at the civil rights movement and what
Yes,
specifically my people contributed, the boomers, now my generation gets to put words. And because there's been such a powerful movement of language in this generation. I mean, you know, and how people, they do pronouns and just all the different things, the different ways people express themselves. How I don't say homeless anymore. I say unhoused. And the system of whiteness will be like, oh, everybody's trying to be so PC and woke. No, you're trying to give dignity to someone's experience. And if me saying Black Turtle Islander or, you know, African, like if me saying that gives power and acknowledgement to Indigenous sisters and brothers in the struggle, then it makes them feel more seen and heard. Why the hell would I not do that? You know, it's like we have to constantly speak truth to power. You know, I just feel it in my spirit, just this jump in my spirit of like, that's a new element of awareness that I need to carry with me to make each other more visible, because they're not going to do it. So we have to do it. You know? So
No, I think that everything, all the rambling I said could be encapsulated within that phrase, Black Turtle Islander, African Turtle Islander, because that unites our struggles of like, yes, I am fighting for Black liberation in the context of Turtle Island. It honors that side. And then from my perspective, we have to change our language. I know there's a huge movement to stop saying the word slaves and start saying the word enslaved, which again is about putting the onus on people who enslaved. There's no such thing as a slave. And actually in my PhD dissertation, I just want to say this is a real excerpt that I put in my dissertation, in my little tiny attempt to be in solidarity with folks. It's by Grills et al. And they say, which I was honored to put in juxtaposition with other things in the dissertation about Indigenous liberation. They say, Black people were not quote unquote slaves. They were enslaved. Right. Black people were human victims of the heinous act of enslavement. One of the most brutal inventions of civilization was the creation of a thing called slave. In the United States, the thing called slave was invented to resolve the cognitive dissonance inherent in a society that proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet treated African people as commodities. It turned human beings into objects. I know that's not a complete explanation, but I'm also doing my part to I haven't said the word slave with any intentionality for many years now because that made sense to me. I'm like, what? Like, I wouldn't want to be called, a ward. That's what the United States calls Native Americans. That we're just wards of the state. We're just, dependent imbeciles of the state. Like, why would I use that slave word in that context? It doesn't make sense. So I love what you said about like, how, people are like, oh, don't be woke, don't be PC. But I love what you said. It's like, no, this is unraveling the power of language, which normalizes oppression and flipping it on its head and starting to normalize responsibility and accountability for people who need to take accountability. So I'm behind you there. And I really appreciate that I was able to give you an aha moment And I had many aha moments myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Julie Black. It made me think about Julie Black when she sang the Canadian national anthem and she changed the words. And she's a Black woman. And she's saying, the words are, "Oh, Canada, our home and native land." But she changed the words to, "Oh, Canada, our home on native land." And so the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa, they honored her. And because in that moment of just her changing one word, it just pulled back a veil and made people who have been rendered invisible by anthems and words and expressions that have been taken as mainstream. It made them feel so seen that they honored her in appreciation for just changing, saying our home and native land, changing that to our home on native land.
Right.
And it just made me think of that moment. Powerful.
Yes, and that is her contribution of her generation, and it is so important. And then maybe next generation will say, "Oh, Turtle Island, the indigenous lands on which we are squatting on," because other assumption that this is our home, which I do want. I want people to feel home here. I want people of all races to feel home here. I really do. I just want them to know that, like, it's not an entitlement of our home, but it is a place that, like you said, resting on bloody soil, that it is by the invitation of indigenous peoples that it would maybe become our home. And that until then, we are guests, we are visitors in solidarity, in Eve Tuck say, some have talked about permanent fugitivity, but giving that fugitivity a rest and saying, you no longer have to be a fugitive. Come be in our communities, come rest, come sit here at the invitation of indigenous peoples, which we've always wanted to do. If you look at the history, indigenous peoples were always coming to the shore with like gifts and food, and we saved all the pilgrims' lives. Like, we were always wanting this to be a home for everyone, but not at the expense of our entire way of life, And so we got to do it. We got to start over. We got to redo it and say, all right, everyone who comes to what we call America, quote unquote, don't look to Joe Biden for permission on how to be here. Look to the indigenous peoples. You are not in America. You are in Turtle Island. And we, even though we don't have the official title of president or Congress or cabinet or whatever, we are the legitimate holders of those titles. So come to us and ask us, how do I be on this land? How do I be a good guest? Do I take my shoes off when I get in the house? Do I say thank you in your language? And like, I wouldn't go to Italy and say, this is mine now. I don't got to learn Italian. You all should speak English, or you all should speak Navajo. When you go to another country, you go as a guest and you go politely. And so that's what we're excited to do, is start again. Let's start this over. Let's say, okay, here we are all. We didn't ask to be born here in Turtle Island, but here we are. How do we make the best of it and come again with humility and joy and say, look, how do we walk behind the people who were here in a good way, in a way that also our side as Native people, we have to give that home and that refuge and say, okay, you are home now, but on these terms of respect, reciprocity, relationality, and first and foremost, respect.
Dignity. Yes, I agree. I'm with you. I stand with you in that, and I receive that. It's so funny. For me, the Julie Black story, it touched me. But for you, it's a very small step, but it's not enough. And it's like, we have to mind our efforts. We have to understand like the weight of what we're doing, and that it's not enough. Like we tell white people all the time, white people want, oh, I want to learn. I want you to teach me. I'm not responsible for teaching you, and for a Black person to say that, that's too much. Like, oh my gosh, they're trying to help. No, you get to establish the terms. It's like in our house, I'm married 26 years this year, and we have 3 sons, 25, 18, and 16.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that's important here in our home is that you get to say how you want to be loved. It's not love until the person is able to receive it as love. And so, you could give someone a bouquet of flowers, but if they are deathly allergic, then that's not a gift. We have to learn how to love and honor people in a way that's meaningful for them. And it's not selfish for someone to establish the terms in which they are loved and cared for. It's not just innately selfish for me to say, this is how I feel most seen and heard. This is how I feel most cared for. This is how I feel, most honored. This is the way I perceive that you are bestowing dignity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I also don't want to discount that one word. I think it's such a powerful step in the right direction. So although it quote unquote might not be enough, it is. And yes, we can always push ourselves to do more. So I know we've been on for a while.
Absolutely.
And I just really appreciate Yes, me too. I've just loved this whole conversation, and we're going to put some links, in the podcast description of more articles that you can check out that really lay out the solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities for the synergy of our movements, for the creation and the deepening of our movements. And I just can't thank you enough, Katina, for coming here with your whole self and pushing back on me and allowing me to push back on you in a safe space to disagree, a safe space to push each other further. And I think these conversations are quiet beneath the surface, but we need to bring them up and out. And to all the non-Black, non-Native listeners there, thank you for listening. And I hope this gave you tools as well. Like Katina said, the Black and white conversation is not of Black creation. It is of the creation of whiteness. So how can you play a part in making it less of a Black and white conversation? And as you fight so hard for Black liberation, remembering that you're doing that on Turtle Island and that there is Indigenous liberation at the same time. Just thank you for listening. Thank you for holding space as Katina and I hold space for each other. And, maybe there's a part 2 coming up soon for this conversation. But I did want to give us a chance to close in case we both have to get back to our busy lives and everything. But I think we did a good job of really working the soil of this conversation. And we got pretty far down the road there. And I just appreciate you from the bottom of my heart, sister, for meeting me halfway in this discussion.
Same, sister. I am grateful for you, and I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm so glad that we were able to connect, and I would love a part 2, 3, and however many more parts to this conversation. And I hope that we can stay connected, and we will definitely be sharing this on the Black History for White People podcast and leveraging our resources to point to your work, because it's so necessary, and you are a gift, you are a voice to your people. I'm really excited about, continuing our partnership and, continuing in the discussion.
Me too. It's so exciting to have this conversation and to build those bridges. And I honor you, not just as my Black sister, but as my Indigenous sister. I don't care if it's 1/16th, 1/32nd. That we have a, what do they call it? A 1-drop rule on our side of we don't care. If you are Indigenous, and thank you for honoring your Indigenous ancestors by honoring me and my people's struggle, and so I see you in both capacities. And we're both musicians, we're both voices. So we have that in common as well. And, there's so much more we could have said. There's a lot more we could have said, but we're going to leave a lot of resources in the description if you want to deepen this exploration for yourself personally. And to all my Indigenous brothers and sisters and siblings listening, let's stand behind the Black community and beside. as folks who are working to uproot the system of anti-Blackness in our communities and in the world. And yeah, that's what I got to say at this moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I would also just want to add that my husband, his grandmother, she was half Blackfoot. Her mother was full-blooded Blackfoot. And so both sides of our family have that bloodline. So I'm grateful for you. And I look forward to us chatting again. I sent you a picture of my great grandmother in the chat, just so you could see her face in the other chat. So I'll text you that picture as well, just so you could see, her face and mine. So.
Oh, please do. Please do. I love that hybridity of our respective earth-based cultures. It's very beautiful. So thank you for sharing. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening and have a beautiful day. Shout out to the whole Nihizhi, Our Voices, Indigenous Solutions podcast team, especially Lincia Begay, our editor, Jen Miller, our social media manager, and to the Calliopeia Foundation for their generous support to make all this happen. Thank you for listening to this partnership between Nihizhi, Our Voices, and Black History for White People. Now enjoy two songs, one by co-host Katina Stone Butler and the other by Lyla June, highlighting the beauty and challenges of our mutual struggles for abolition and liberation.
Some don't believe it when they see it with their own eyes. Somebody tell me what's such a crime. Doing everyday things, we get brutalized. Prosecute the victims and put them on trial to justify the reason they was crucified. Tati home with her nephew. Blue shadow outside. Shot her black shade in the night. Second Amendment. Right. Botham Jean chilling in his own crib. While he was eating a bowl of ice cream. Ice cream. Ice cream. Oh, stop killing me. Yeah, 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 yeah. Stop killing me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Stories be the skin tones, but they ain't changed. Shifting all the like they did it to themselves. Going through their trash, digging up their past, make their lives a crime. Lying to deny, making up excuses for the why they had to die. Putting them on trial, shame the victims. Why? If they were, should've done what could have kept them from demise. But the truth be told, they were being why? Somebody tell me what's such a crime. Doing everyday things, we get brutalized. Glorify the killer, put the dead on trial, and justify the victims being crucified. Brianna's killer still out there, living their best life, family crying. Every day and every night. Elijah just playing violin. With his family in the car, ice cream, ice cream, ice cream. Oh, ice cream, yeah. Ice cream, ice cream. Oh, stop killing me. My dear, you do not know me, but I know you very well, so well. Silent in the battle, but you're quick to pull a card for show and tell. Do tell. Don't tell me that you'll stand when you don't have a will to walk. Don't tell me that you'll walk if you don't have a will to talk. Don't tell me that you're broke, cause don't make us know who you are. Don't tell me that you're broken when you ain't made it all. My brothers, what is peace and what's this wrong? Why is this a message you're attacking with your tongues? Why is this a message you're attacking babies ain't coming home, and they killed in their own home. Mary, Martha moan when our babies ain't coming home, and they killed in their own home. Mary weep, Martha moan, ice cream chillin' at home. He was killed in his own home, yeah, yeah. Mary weep, Martha moan, with a nephew playing videos, and he shot her through her window. Mary weep, Martha moan, when they getting candy from the store, watching neighborhood and shot 'em cold. Hey, Mary weep, Martha moan, pulled over for speeding, no, strung up off the jail cell floor. Hey, Mary weep, Martha moan, lying on a 14-year-old. His face ain't even recognizable. Hey, Mary weep, yeah. Martha moan, falsely convicted for a rape, yo. The exonerated 5, yo. Hey, Mary weep, yeah. Martha moan, they framed my mom-in-law for murder, y'all, and she died behind the prison wall. Got the license out the but we will keep fighting on it. Black lives matter. Black excellence leads the way as we praise, create, invent, and innovate. Our faith as we fight, our joy in the face of adversity. We're more than a hashtag. We're more than a soundbite. Black lives, they matter. Why? Black lives, they matter. This is our black Indigenous people, shine your light, we are equal. I remember the days when our prayers were illegal. I remember the days when being Indian was lethal. Yeah, we had a rough past, but get ready for the sequel. Get ready for the glorious comeback of our people. Oh yeah, rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart, can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. All nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's the time. All nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's the time. With forgiveness as my bow and my prayers as my arrows, pull them back and let go. I watch them fly like sparrows. Have hope. Yeah, have hope. With compassion as my shield and faith down to my marrow, I will walk the pollen path even when it gets narrow. Yeah, I resurrect. Yes, you can bet that we seen the single mama raising children on the res. We seen domestic violence tear apart what we have left. We seen the alcohol take it all and leave us dead. We seen the children take their lives when they can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. Can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war, but we've seen it all before. And now we know we can change it, 'cause that's why we were born. We know we are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the ones Grandma has been praying for. So rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart, can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. Pueblo hermoso, levántense, es nuestro tiempo. No tienes que esconderte más, ahora es nuestro tiempo. Mujer indígena, tú eres tan sagrada. Traigas medicina de tu suelo todavía. A pesar del abuso de tu cuerpo y tu tierra, respetamos tus ancestros y la suya cultura. Hombre indígena, tú eres honorable y yo veo la fuerza que todavía sobrevive. A pesar del abuso de tu raza venerable, yo respeto tus ritos, tus danzas, tus padres. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz y no vamos a escondernos más. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz y no vamos a escondernos más.
They say that history is written by the victors. But how can there be a victor when the war isn't over? The battle has only just begun, and Creator is sending His very best warriors. And this time, It isn't Indians versus cowboys. No, this time, it is all the beautiful races of humanity together on the same side, and we are fighting to replace our fear with love. And this time, bullets, arrows, and cannonballs won't save us. The only weapons that are useful in this battle are the weapons of truth, faith, and compassion.